The hallways of Ridgewood High School buzzed with the usual chatter of students moving between classes. For most, it was just another day. But for Emily Johnson, it was about to become a day she would never forget. Emily, a senior known for her rebellious streak, had always flirted with the edges of the school's strict code of conduct. Today, however, she had crossed a line that would lead her straight into the office of headmistress Mrs. Harper. It all started during the third period break. Feeling frustrated after a difficult chemistry test, Emily decided she needed a moment to herself. She slipped away from the crowds and headed for the bathrooms near the old gym, the ones that were rarely checked by the staff. There, she pulled out a cigarette she had stashed in her bag. She knew it was against the rules, but she didn't care. She just needed a few minutes to calm her nerves. As she lit up, the sharp scent of tobacco filled the confined space. She took a deep drag, exhaling slowly, her mind momentarily drifting away from the pressures of school life. But her solitude was short-lived. Unbeknownst to Emily, a passing teacher caught a whiff of smoke and quickly reported it to the office. Within minutes, the door to the bathroom swung open, and there stood Mrs. Harper herself, her stern face framed by her salt and pepper hair, eyes narrowing in disappointment behind her glasses. "Emily Johnson." Mrs. Harper's voice was icy, cutting through the smoke-filled air. "Put that out immediately and come with me." Emily's heart sank. She hastily stubbed out the cigarette and followed the headmistress down the long hallway. The other students watched silently as she walked past, their whispers and curious glances following her all the way to the office. Emily could feel her stomach tightening with each step. She knew this was serious. Once inside Mrs. Harper's office, the headmistress closed the door firmly and motioned for Emily to sit. "Do you know why you're here, Emily?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, ma'am," Emily replied, her usual defiance replaced by a sense of impending dread. "I was caught smoking in the bathrooms." "That's right," Mrs. Harper confirmed. "You are aware of the school's policy on smoking, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Emily muttered. Mrs. Harper continued, "Ridgewood High has rules for a reason, Emily. We expect all our students to adhere to them, especially a senior like you who should set an example for others. You've made a choice, and now you must face the consequences." Emily's eyes widened slightly, realizing what was about to happen. She had heard stories from other students, stories about the rattan cane kept in Mrs. Harper's office, an old-fashioned but effective tool for discipline. Until now, she had thought it was just a myth. Mrs. Harper opened a tall wooden cabinet and pulled out a rattan cane. It was long, slender, and looked menacing in her hands. "You will receive 5 strokes with this cane," Mrs. Harper stated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Stand up and bend over the desk." Emily's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand and walk over to the desk. She bent over, gripping the edges tightly, her breath quickening with a mix of fear and anticipation. She could hear the cane swishing through the air as Mrs. Harper tested its weight. "These strokes are not just a punishment," Mrs. Harper said, positioning herself behind Emily. "They are a reminder of the standards we hold here and the behavior we expect." Without further delay, the first stroke landed with a sharp crack, sending a searing pain through Emily's backside. She clenched her teeth, trying not to cry out. The second stroke followed, harder than the first, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes. By the third stroke, a small gasp escaped her lips. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, a deep, burning sting that radiated with each breath. The fourth stroke brought tears streaming down her face, and by the fifth, Emily was quietly sobbing. Her hands gripped the desk so tightly, her knuckles were white. When it was finally over, Mrs. Harper stepped back and set the cane down on her desk. "You may stand up now," she said, her voice softer but still firm. Emily slowly straightened, wiping her tears with trembling hands. Her body ached, but there was also a strange sense of relief. The punishment was over. "Let this be a lesson, Emily," Mrs. Harper said, looking her in the eye. "We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that matters. I hope you will think twice before breaking the rules again." "Yes, ma'am," Emily whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. She nodded, still sniffling. "Good. Now, go to the restroom, compose yourself, and then return to your class," Mrs. Harper instructed. Emily nodded again, murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and left the office. As she walked down the hallway, her body sore from the caning, she felt a wave of emotions: regret, embarrassment, but also a newfound resolve. The punishment had been harsh, but it was a lesson she would carry with her. She promised herself she wouldn't give Mrs. Harper a reason to call her to that office again. From that day forward, Emily kept her head down, focused on her studies, and made better choices. The sting of the cane was a constant reminder of the consequences of her actions, and she was determined not to make the same mistake twice.